Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for August 10th, 2021. I want to begin by looking at this latest rant that was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which was designed to scare policymakers as well as the populations of the world into rejecting the need for energy production, electricity production, and instead to embrace the radical extremist environmentalist plan, which is the Green New Deal. The idea that we're about to boil the planet over. The language in this report is extraordinary, but the conclusions that are reached are also extraordinary, in which they're not supported by real science. The IPCC warned that climate change is occurring much faster than they had predicted due to increases in carbon dioxide. Their main focus is that we must go to net carbon zero as soon as possible in order to reduce the temperature by eliminating or cutting out the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. This report claims that we now have the highest levels of carbon dioxide in 2 million years. Not quite sure how they come up with that figure. But then listen to the language from the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres. He said, "This report must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet." Now, this is the line that's come from people like Sir Michael Bloomberg, who has a think tank that's committed to eliminating coal. This is the line that's come out from John Kerry, who's the climate czar for the United States, that we have to get rid of coal, we have to get rid of nuclear, we have to get rid of all fossil fuel use, and replace it with forms of energy which are unreliable and inefficient. Now, Guterres, who said this is a red alert warning, was backed up by none other than that great scientist, climate scientist, Greta Thunberg, who said, "This may be the last wake-up call that we get." Well, I doubt that that's the case, because they're going to keep sounding this day after day, and they're going to make up new figures to make it seem worse. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Just last week, some IPCC analysts admitted that the present generation of climate models are, quote, overheated and too alarmist, unquote. That is, the scientists themselves who are looking at the data said that the models are designed to feed the conclusion that we're running short of time to save the planet from global warming, and therefore the models are unreliable. Well, that's the way these models work. That's what's wrong with computer modeling, that it all depends on the data that you feed into the model. And if you want to prove something, you can prove it by the selection of data that you input. Now, the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, Gavin Schmidt, commented on this, and he said, "There's significant doubt that the models can be trusted." And he said he's speaking on behalf of many, many scientists who have looked at the latest modeling. He said, quote, "You end up with numbers for even the near term that are insanely scary and wrong." That's a quote, that the models are producing numbers for even the near term, quote, that are insanely scary and wrong. Now, this latest report is designed to shape the atmosphere going into the November COP26 conference in Glasgow, Scotland, where Boris Johnson is going to be making climate change the leading issue of his administration. You know, it's interesting. He's gone from stumbling and bumbling over Brexit to now demanding climate change and that the British gunship diplomacy be exported to the South China Sea. But this is also what Biden's policy is. This is the policy of many of the people in both parties in the Congress. This is definitely the media line. And so when you see these reports, just keep in mind that they're squelching opposition. There are a group of scientists, almost 1,000 scientists who are real climate scientists in Italy, who put out a report titled "There is no climate crisis." And the Schiller Institute back on July 24th sponsored a conference which included some of those scientists on that same topic, "There is no climate crisis." So after you hear the propaganda and hype from the IPCC report, go to theschillerinstitute.com and watch what real scientists are saying about the actual situation that's confronting us. The reality is we need more electricity. We need more power. And we need such things as clean coal. It's also the case that major governments such as India, Russia, China are not going along with these conclusions. And most of the developing sector is unwilling to submit their countries to the kind of austerity demands that are coming from the quackademics from the IPCC. Now, speaking of quackademics, let me just turn for a moment to this whole question of inflation, where we're seeing a continued increase in inflation. Inflation is now at a 5.4% annual rate, and I think that's greatly understated because they leave out many of the things that are necessary for existence that are inflating at a much more rapid rate. We're seeing a speculative frenzy, whether it's people buying video clips, digital art, Bitcoin, stocks. You see the commodity prices going up and down. People aren't sure what to do with their money, but they're looking for the quick buck. How can I protect myself and my family in the face of inflation? Well, there's a simple answer to that. We have to change the policy. We have to take power away from the economists at the Federal Reserve and the central banks who have concluded that everything they're doing is right. They just have to do more of it, more liquidity pumping. Now, this is looking increasingly like the typical bubbles, the tulip bubble of the 17th century. Looks a lot like the mortgage-backed security bubble, only on steroids this time. 11 trillion new dollars were pumped into the system this year. How much of that went into small businesses, into entrepreneurial enterprises? How much of it went into research and development? How much into real productive manufacturing that actually is what's necessary to increase real wealth as opposed to paper values or computer notions? We're seeing derivative speculation through the roof. Approximately $2 quadrillion worth of derivative valuations are floating around out there that banks feel they have to protect, and hedge funds and equity funds. How do they protect it? They get liquidity from the Fed. Now, for some reason, the Federal Reserve is making up a story that the economy is heating up too quickly for the supply to catch up, and that's why there's inflation. They're ignoring what's really overabundant, which is money in the hands of speculators. The idea that Powell won't talk about that tells you the real story. The Federal Reserve, along with all the global central banks, are going for a financial regime change, which is the Great Reset, which is to do whatever is necessary to protect the big banks by the central banks, and not to concern themselves with the vast majority of the population that's suffering the effects of inflation, whether it's higher rent, higher home prices, higher cost rental cars. I read that you can pay $300 to rent a car per day in Orlando, Florida right now. I mean, you can almost, in the old days, that would be more than a monthly payment on a new car. That's for one day. A trailer could be $1,000 rent. So what we're looking at is an out-of-control inflation. Now, here's the irony. We're coming up on the 50-year anniversary of what Richard Nixon did on August 15, 1971, to take away the gold reserve backing of the dollar. When Nixon did it, under pressure from global monetarists such as George Shultz, Paul Volcker, and Arthur Burns, he said the reason he took that action was to protect the dollar from financial speculation. Well, by doing that, by ending the fixed exchange rate system, he actually opened the doors for ever increasing levels of speculation, which is now what's behind the global drive for inflation. So on this Saturday, August 14th, the LaRouche Legacy Foundation will be sponsoring an event to look at what Lyndon LaRouche forecast going into August 15th, 1971, how he analyzed what was going to happen, both in terms of the austerity, the move toward environmentalism and Malthusian policy, and then also his solutions, what he proposed to ensure that there's adequate credit from a national banking system going into physical goods production, not into the hands of swindlers and speculators. So join us this Saturday starting at 9 a.m. On a program titled, So Are You Finally Willing to Learn Economics? Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.